Well, Sterling is still out of town, and am I on?
You are not on, but I think I am on. This is a blowback to the past. Those of you who have maybe joined us in the last few years have not seen this combination of a team approach to teaching, but for 8 years, David and I taught this class and just kind of worked back and forth off of each other, and we're going to do that again today. And David's going to introduce our topic and scripture. Matter of fact, you may want to turn to Daniel chapter 6, because that's where we're going to be spending the majority of our time. And David's going to introduce that, and then we will just work off of that together.
One of the things that you notice when you're reading Paul's letters, he will often encourage the people that he is writing his letters to live a life worthy of the gospel, or live a life worthy of the manner of the gospel. He says that a particular specific reference to that is Philippians 1:27, where he says, whatever happens, live your life worthy of the gospel. And so today's lesson is the example of what that means, what it means to live a life worthy of the gospel. And it's basically summed up in a word, one word, and that is personal integrity. Personal integrity that is shaped by the Spirit of God living in us. Personal integrity that is shaped into a form that looks like Christ. And so we're going to look at the story of Daniel chapter 6, because it is really a case study in what it means to live your life worthy of the gospel, and what happens when you do that. It is a case study of a person who lives with integrity. Integrity means the steadfast adherence, or I would call it faithfulness, to a moral or ethical code. It is a mark of being complete, whole, mature. It is the freedom from corrupting influence or motive. It is defined by consistency. We won't read this story, but one way to introduce this topic is to read the story of the Rechabites in Jeremiah chapter 35. They are a people who were consistent. They kept their word. God wanted to use them as an example of people of consistency and integrity who kept their word. And they were people who were asked to come to the temple by Jeremiah to drink some wine. And they had made a vow never to drink wine, and they had done that for 200 years in their family. They had not drunk wine, and they resisted, and God used them as an example of Israel, said, you need to be like the Rechabites. So it includes consistency. The word integrity defines someone who is in public what he or she is in private. It is what keeps a student from cheating. It's what makes an employee trustworthy or a hard worker. It's what allows a teacher to be on time and in the classroom. It is what keeps one who is in charge of someone else's money from being a thief. It makes a spouse faithful. It makes a friend loyal. As we think about the headlines that we've been reading or hearing on TV, the world that we live in is in great need of men and women of integrity, or men and women who live their lives worthy of the gospel. Integrity, or living lives worthy of the gospel, is important to us personally. And Daniel chapter 6 is a study of this topic of integrity, of living your life worthy of the gospel.
There are 4 spheres of integrity, and they describe how we relate to other people, how we relate to ourselves and to other people in different levels. And we have a public life and we have a very private life. One of these spheres, the very basic sphere, is our private life.
Before we get there, Wilbur, let's read the story.
Okay.
So if you're not there, turn to Daniel chapter 6.
Okay.
And we're going to familiarize ourselves with this story. Lots of times we know this story very well because we've known it from our childhood, and a lot of times we relegate this story to, this is just one of those biblical stories that's really good for kids. But the more insightful things that we can find in this story is really about living your life worthy of the gospel and living a life of integrity, because this is what we see in this man Daniel in this story. That's the overall message of this story. A man who, in an exiled country, who has been living his life the whole time that he has been there in captivity since his youth, as a man of integrity, and how God has honored this man who has lived his life worthy of one who says, I serve God. We can see that from the very beginning in Daniel chapter 1, right on to the very end, that Daniel was a man of integrity. He was one who was what he was in private was what he was in public as well. And this is also an example of the importance for always reading the Old Testament. I remember as a younger minister teaching an Old Testament book, and somebody said, "Why are we teaching the Old Testament? The Old Testament is past. It's but the foundation for Christian theology is the Old Testament. If you don't read the Old Testament, you really are going to have a hard time understanding the New."
The earliest church, remember when Paul was traveling, he always went to the synagogues and they spoke from the scriptures. He taught the scriptures, and the scriptures, the only scriptures they had were the Hebrew scriptures. So that followed over into the very earliest days of the church.
So we're going to be, as we read this story, be thinking about how God honors a man of integrity and how God honors a person who lives their life worthy of one who says they are dedicated to God, or in Christian terms, as Paul would put it, one who lives his life worthy of the gospel. So we're just going to simply read the story to remind us again of Daniel and the situation here.
The scene begins right after the end of the Babylonian kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar has died. His son Belshazzar has taken over. He was deposed because of his arrogance, and he was overthrown by the Medes and Persians.
And if you looked at Daniel, he would look a little bit like Wilbur here. Because
Sure.
he was not a young man like me when this story is told or occurs. Daniel's probably 70 or 80 years old by now.
This is a story that lesson we've taught in Africa a couple of times, and that's usually a part of the presentation in Africa, is something about who is older here.
We call him in Zambia, Tonga, he is a Mudala, an old man.
Okay, the story begins with Darius, the king of the Persians, who has taken over from the Babylonians. So in Daniel chapter 6, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find ground for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has to do with something to do with the law of his God." So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered according with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing.
Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. This was not something new. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought, placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?"
Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. May my God send his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Now, this just didn't happen. This was something, this conduct of Daniel's was one that had been developed over a lifetime. And it has developed from what Wilbur introduced a few minutes ago, the 4 spheres of individual life and influence from which integrity or living a life worthy of the gospel emanates from, its source, where it comes from. And each of us lives our lives in the midst of these 4 influences of life, these spheres of influence and life. And the first one is obviously private life.
The private life is what we live just between ourselves and God. Nobody shares in our private life. It's what we are within ourselves. We don't even share that with family. We don't even share that with our spouse, even our closest friends. It's our private life. It's who we really are inside. And it is going to be that which will govern every other aspect of our lives. So who we really are, who we are between us and God, the only other being that knows who I really am, what I really think, what I really value, what my priorities are, is God.
And we don't have time to go through this, but a great psalm on this that reflects this is Psalm 139, where the psalmist says, "Where can I go from your spirit? If I go to the depths, you are there. If I go to the heights, you're there. East, west, in complete darkness, darkness is light to you. You are there." And this is a reflection of a person who has, in their deep personal life, realized that God is shaping that, and God must shape that, and we must have this personal life, this intimate fellowship with God, where God shapes us into the persons that He intends us to be, and that happens in our private life with God. And we develop that through prayer, meditation, Bible reading, taking time to commune with our God. And then we move to the personal life. We go from the private life to the personal life, and this includes that part of your life that is shared by a small circle of family, your wife, your spouse, your mother, your father, your brothers and sisters, and some very, very close friends who you know very well, who you share things that you would not share with anybody else. And these are people who know us very, very, very well.
The third sphere is our professional life. That's the life that we have on the job. with coworkers, with the people who spend a lot of time with us. And it's how we interact with those people, what they observe about us in our professional life. I think of what I do as a rehabilitation counselor, and particularly as an expert witness in litigation. Credibility and integrity is extremely important. I've seen a lot of experts come and go over the years because they were not people of integrity. They were not people who would say the same thing all the time. If they were working for one side, they'd say what they wanted to hear. If they worked for another side, they'd say what they wanted to hear. And these people didn't survive doing that. Integrity means that I'm going to say the same thing no matter which side I'm on. I'm looking for that which is truthful, which is honest, which is trustworthy. And that's a professional quality that we need in our workplaces and how we interact with other people.
It's that wider circle of influence, of interaction with people, and we all recognize that it is here that our reputation is recognized, and people make judgments about us. The other day, someone was telling me about a person who is is a contractor, and he does repair work and he builds things, and we were needing to have somebody down at the Hope Center to do some repairs, and two people's names came up, and immediately someone said, "He is really good," and the other person said about the other person is, "We don't want him. He does not do a good job," and just went on and on. So that professional life is where our reputation is developed, and it can be good or bad depending on what comes from our personal and especially our private life.
Jim?
I was just going to say the story with Daniel. These satraps, tax collectors. Here, Daniel, a man of integrity, was doing all right. It sounds like he was pointing in on their thunder because they weren't.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. When we get through these spheres, we're going to go and apply these to Daniel and see how these different spheres applied to Daniel's life. And those men, those satraps are antithetical to, they're just the opposite of who Daniel was. So good observation.
Our professional life forms what our supervisors, our bosses, our co-workers think of us, how they view us, and how we do our job, how we are evaluated for our work performance. That's how our values in our professional life, our integrity in our professional life affects us in the workplace.
And then there's that widest sphere of influence, our public life. Here, anyone and everyone that we have dealings with, interactions with in the course of daily life is given some impression of us throughout the course of the week. People hear our names and they form an opinion about us one way or another in the public world. It can be called our public persona. So where is our integrity rooted in these spheres? It's not in our public life. It is revealed in our public life, but it's not developed there. It's not in our professional life. It's reinforced if we truly have integrity. It's not in our personal life where we live intimately and closely with family and friends. It's reflected there too. But integrity is rooted in the private life, that part of us that is alone with God, that part of us that will live as long as God lives. Think about that. That part of our life that will live as long as God lives. That's eternal. Our personal, individual integrity is conceived in that private world. We see that in Daniel's life. He prayed every day, as he always did. He developed that, and if you know the story of Daniel, you know the very first chapter, you have a story of Daniel who acts in a very courageous way because he has spent time in private, allowing God to shape his character, his life. As a Christian, we want to live lives worthy of Jesus Christ because he loved us and he sacrificed all for us. And he has told us that we are to be salt and light. And the source of that salt of light is what God develops in us in our private life. It begins with a personal integrity that is shaped by God, by Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. And so here we have Daniel. He's a good example of the power of integrity that flows through one totally dedicated life to God.
If you notice when we reading in chapter 6 about, let's see, in verse 3, Daniel had distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, such that the king planned to place him over the whole kingdom. And when these groups were jealous of that, and when they began to try to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent.
So there was something.
What a government official that would be.
He was not. I think that's interesting here that he says he was put in charge. These guys were put in charge because the king didn't want to suffer any loss. So these men were supposed to be good stewards. And Daniel was one who excelled. These men were the cream of the crop, and he excelled above them. Some versions say that in Daniel was an excellent spirit was in him, something that made him stand out, and we understand that to be his dedication to God and his relationship with God, which allowed him to have this personal integrity that God blessed in this pagan world. And so he is one who stands out because of his integrity, and his integrity allows him to work in such a way that he's not negligent. He's not negligent.
You know, this is one of those cases where you've got somebody on a hunt to find something that he's done wrong. You know, most of the time, if you take the fine microscope and look at somebody's performance or somebody's actions, and if you go on the hunt, you're going to find something. Well, these guys were on the hunt for whatever they could find about Daniel, and they had the microscope out, and they were looking at everything Daniel was doing, and they couldn't find anything to charge him with. No corruption, no dishonesty, nothing could they find about him.
Integrity comes from a God-given inner power, not by outer promotion. Just think about it. It was Daniel's integrity, not his intelligence, not his identity, nor his insight that brought him into this place of responsibility. It was his integrity that brought him to this place of prominence. It came from God, not from outer promotion. But if you think about the men who were there to destroy Daniel, as Wilbur said, they were trying to promote themselves over Daniel. They were jealous, and they had no integrity. They even had to flatter the king in order to try to set a trap to entrap Daniel and bring him down. Solomon said this about wise people: the integrity of the upright guides them. Proverbs 11:3. And we see this in Daniel, that his integrity guided him in his actions. He kept doing what he always did, what was formed in him early. He just kept doing as he did before.
You know, this was formed in Daniel's private life. These values that Daniel had and that he exhibited here in his professional life as an administrator were formed in his private life in his relationship with God. They formed the values that Daniel is going to display as he is a professional administrator in the government of the king.
And if you think about integrity, there's two things that test our personal integrity. One is adversity, and the other is prosperity. First of all, Daniel was prosperous here. He was successful. And what caused his integrity to be tested was the fact that he was very successful, and others did not like it, and they wanted to bring him down, and he could have compromised. But his integrity was not for sale. He had an integrity. You know, we all have bank accounts. Daniel had an integrity account, and we all have an integrity account. And he had a lot of savings in a lot of deposits into his integrity account, and he was not going to withdraw from it. His integrity was not for sale, and so he was able to act from that, and no matter what happened, he was going to be a person of integrity.
You know, Daniel could have, when this decree came out, he could have gotten away from the window, went to his closet and prayed to God 3 times a day, but he didn't. He went back to the window. He did what he had been doing all the time, well aware. Daniel knew what this decree was about. He knew the risk that he was taking by going to the window and praying. He was not intimidated by that. He was not afraid of it. He continued his faithfulness to God in the same way. He didn't compromise.
So in prosperity, his integrity stood, and also in adversity, which we know the rest of the story. In adversity, I mean, he didn't compromise or change. He let come what may and stayed faithful, even though it hurt. Integrity, from Psalm 15, integrity, another definition of integrity or an example of integrity is keeping your oath, keeping your word even when it hurts. And Daniel was committed to God and would stay committed to God no matter what, even though it would cost him. And Daniel was assuming that it would cost him his life, being thrown into the lion's den. So Daniel's integrity passed both of these tests, adversity and prosperity. Integrity is also reflected in our personal life. We've talked about that Daniel had an inner circle of friends. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They were those who, in that very first chapter, were the men who refused to eat the king's food and put to test the steward that was in charge of them by saying, "Just let us eat vegetables and let it see what happens." And then we know the rest of the stories about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. He surrounded himself. His integrity was enforced by his professional life. They could not find anything wrong with it, so they had to conjure up something to try to get them.
You know, back in chapter 1, Daniel was the one who resolved not to violate his values, violate his commitment to his God. And when he was provided, when the king ordered these young men to be fed from the king's table and the king's wine, the king's food, and Daniel said, I don't want to compromise myself. And then he asked the person who was in charge of feeding them, he said, just let us eat vegetables and water for 10 days. And because this first person was saying, if you didn't eat what the king says, it's going to be my life. It's going to be up. And when after the 10 days, Daniel and his friends appeared healthier than the other, and they were able to continue their observance of the rules of the Hebrews.
Yeah. They could not find fault with him in his professional life, and they tried to find, and where they found it was in his personal life and in his private life with God. But those who have integrity find that it is reinforced in their professional life. Paul talks about this. He talks about it in the context of slaves and masters. There's a principle there that applies in our world today with employer and employee. In Ephesians 6:5 and following, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart. I think that would describe Daniel, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly if you are serving the Lord and not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. There are some employees that have their eye on the boss and not on the job. You know what I mean? They have their eye on the boss and not on the job. And when the boss is away, they do what they want to. They slough off. They are negligent. Yeah. Daniel was one who, when the boss wasn't looking, was still working hard. And so that's a person of integrity. The boss does not have to worry. It was also said that about Joseph and Joseph under who was his master in Potiphar. Potiphar didn't have to worry when he had Joseph in charge, because he was not negligent. So they recognize, good employees recognize authority in the home, in the government, in education, in the church, as well as in the marketplace. So,
in my experience as a vocational counselor, far more people lose their jobs because of their behaviors than because of their lack of skills to doing the work. They don't show up on time. They don't pay attention. They can't get along with coworkers. It's behavioral. It's what we call soft skills. Jim would be familiar with these as in the HR realm. Far more people are fired and lose their jobs because of these soft skills of being dependable, being punctual, being present every day. And interestingly, in our youngest generation, whatever letter is being applied to that, there is a lot of problems that employers are having in terms of productivity and getting work done, because these people are more concerned with what's in it for them than than benefiting their employer. And integrity tells us that we are there to do our job. We're there on time. We're there following directions. We're doing what we're supposed to be doing. As David said, whether the boss is watching or not. We are being responsible employees for the tasks that we are given to do.
Bottom line is that we cannot begin a life of integrity in the workplace. It must be there before we get there. It's rooted in that relationship with Christ, and it is something that is formed there, and only then can we use it to influence our culture. The final thing is that integrity is revealed in our public life. We see that Daniel's life was on display, wasn't it? It was on display. And what he was in private was what he was in public, and it is what what got him in trouble. Worldly wise, got him in trouble. His commitment to God was public. It was on display for all to see. It was not compartmentalized, only seen on Sunday and left there in a box on Monday. Daniel was in private what he was in public. And think about this. Integrity is not always appreciated by the world. It is that people with integrity tend to make those without it uncomfortable, don't they? And that's what happened here. They're very uncomfortable with that. And you may pay a high price for your integrity. But the world stops and notices a man of integrity.
Daniel wasn't just being observed by these 120 satraps and administrators who made these accusations against him and had him thrown in the lion's den. He was a high official. He was visible to the whole kingdom. He was visible because he was responsible for the administration of the king's government to the whole nation, to the whole kingdom. And so people in the city, people out in the country, people in other areas were all aware of who Daniel was and what kind of administrator he did. Were they honest in collecting taxes? Were they honest and dependable in performing public service, providing the services that government should provide to people? Daniel was responsible in administering the king's business. And he described himself, I have not, as he came out of the lion's den, he said, I've been dependable and honest to my God, and I have not done anything against you, O king, either.
Here, I hope you noticed at the end of the story how Darius was affected by Daniel's integrity, Daniel's life of dedication to God. Everything that King Darius knew about God, he learned by observing who? Everything that Darius knew about God, he learned by observing Daniel's life and his work and how he did his job, his public life of integrity. And that just goes, we are being watched. We are being watched. The world is asking similar things to what Darius asked Daniel. Will your God be able to deliver you? Did your God deliver you? That's what the world is asking. What difference is God making in your life? They will never know unless we are men and women of integrity, men and women who live their lives worthy of the gospel. One of the things that Paul will say to Titus, he says to teach the people there that there were some things that needed to be done in the churches in Crete. And one of the things he said was that the people should go about doing good. And he talks particularly to slaves there, and he says slaves, he says something similar to them as he said in Ephesians 6, but he says slaves, work hard as to the Lord so as to make the gospel attractive. When we are persons of integrity, we adorn the gospel. A woman makes herself attractive by adorning herself with makeup and hair done and necklaces, and she's trying to make herself attractive. We do the same thing with our lives when we are persons of integrity. We adorn the gospel, and people are attracted not to us, but to the Christ that is formed in us.
Final words. Integrity. Don't leave home without it. Would you bow with me for a closing prayer? Our Father, we thank you for the opportunity to study your word, to learn from those lives of the past that have honored you, and as Daniel has exhibited extraordinary character and integrity in his conduct and in his work in the kingdom of his king. We ask, Father, that we learn from Daniel, and that we become also, that we are people of integrity, and that we live worthy of the gospel that we have accepted in us. Bless us in our assembly. Bless us as we serve you this day. In Jesus we pray. Amen.